At night, the city was lit with bright multicolored lights. In Gamyeokam-dong, countless cars moved along the roads, their headlights weaving through the darkness. On the top floor of the building belonging to D Group, the windows were still glowing. That was where the world's strongest roar team, D1, lived. Inside the professional gamer training room, the 5 members of the #1 team sat before their monitors. Their fingers flew across keyboards, mice clicked furiously, and the screens shone with vivid light. One of them suddenly smiled and muttered that he had finally met Dex. A flash of light filled the monitor as the match began, and the battlefield loaded with different characters entering the war. Demon spotted his opponent from afar. The player with the nickname Dex was controlling a knight, his eyes glowing brilliantly, his expression calm yet confident. Smiling, the pro gamer declared that they would fight with everything they had, and that he would show why their team stood at the top of the world. With a furious roar, his character charged forward. Dex gripped the hilt of his sword. A magical aura surged from him, drawing in the air around his body. In the next instant, he unleashed a devastating strike at the enemy flying toward him. The demon's severed arm fell, its sword plunging into the ground. The monster collapsed, its image rippling as it was defeated. Seeing this, his teammates raised their weapons. One of the girls screamed in disbelief, asking how he could die from a single combo. Her comrade replied that it was fine and that they would handle him. With a swift motion, one of them changed the grip on his blades, and his body began to dissolve into invisibility. A frown creased his face as he stared at the knight's back. Suddenly, Dex turned around. He blocked the invisible attack with ease, his eyes blazing like fire. With a powerful lunge, he secured a double kill. The man with the bushy mustache clenched his teeth, muttering that it was impossible, that Dex had taken out both the tank and the main attacker in one blow. The player beside him shouted for everyone to pull themselves together, insisting that if they held the line they could still win. At that moment, Dex rushed toward them. In the blink of an eye, he was right in front of his opponents. The knight unleashed a flurry of fast, heavy strikes. Almost immediately, a bright light filled each player's screen, followed by the message announcing their defeat. Horror filled the pro gamer's eyes as he realized what had happened. All 5 of them had been taken down alone. On the wall behind them hung their team's flag, but in the game world it was suddenly split in 2. The knight destroyed the enemy flag, sealing their total defeat. Cold sweat slid down one man's face as he stared into Dex's burning eyes. He wondered who this person truly was. Elsewhere, a young man leaned back in his chair and muttered that there was nothing special about it. On his desk lay the most ordinary equipment, and his computer looked nothing like that of a professional gamer. Thinking about his many nicknames, Jae Young told himself that he had used plenty over time, but the last one was Dex. Above the Black Knight's head in the game hovered that very name. He reached for a bag of chips and shook it lightly, telling himself that he was not the type to waste time thinking up fancy nicknames. His goal had always been first place. Realizing the chips were gone, Jang's lips turned downward in annoyance. He licked his lips and wondered if he should finally leave the house to buy another pack, now that he had achieved first place at last. On the ranking table, the nickname Dex had risen to the very top. Placing his hands on the keyboard, he told himself that today he had finally achieved what he wanted. He quickly typed out a message and sent it, thinking that he could finally quit the game. At the same time, shock filled the eyes of the pro gamer. He slammed his fist onto the table, grinding his teeth, as he shouted that Dex was still mocking them, calling him a damn troll. On his monitor, the Black Knight waved his hand and announced that he was quitting the game. Clouds drifted slowly across a blue sky. A day had passed since Dex made his announcement. A truck rumbled along the road, and the driver smiled as he asked whether Dex had really quit the game. He joked that Dex was a troll who had mocked everyone until the very end, then wondered why he had quit, saying that his friend Sadfan should know. The truck suddenly swerved as the other man shouted in rage, saying that they already knew, and that he had no way of understanding what went on in the mind of a weirdo like him. Warm sunlight streamed through the windshield. The driver steadied the wheel and said it was obvious why Dex had left. Many gamers were quitting now, and there was a good reason for it. The world of video games was in decline. Several people stood at a bus stop. Behind them was a large image of a girl with her eyes closed. A powerful computer was displayed, its monitor filled with dense program code and images of the human genome. In the strictest secrecy, the world's largest companies, Electronics, Eros Corporation and Silic, had worked together to create not just a computer, but the first full-fledged virtual world. It could be accessed through a device known as the Dreamer. 3 people stood around the completed project, a massive virtual capsule. The girl in the image smiled and asked whether they were tired of the life they had postponed, and whether they wanted a second chance in a world of endless possibilities. Sunlight bathed a vast kingdom. Folding her arms, the girl said that they were waiting for them and would always be glad to welcome them to Arcadia. An Arcadia company truck stopped at the address of the Dreamer's final customer. The men looked at the crumbling house before them, wondering whether someone living there could really afford such a device. Cracks covered the windows, hinting at a life far removed from the shining world that awaited inside Arcadia. Seeing the truck, the main character smiled broadly and said that his dreamer had finally arrived. Without hesitation, he entered his account login and password. After selecting the Dark Knight, the system asked whether he truly wanted to delete the character. He pressed the confirm button without a second thought, saying that he was already 20 years old and had decided to quit all existing games in order to begin a journey in another world, not just another ordinary game. The Dreamer inscription lit up against a black background. The protagonist lay down inside the capsule. Less than a minute later, he found himself suspended in the sky above a vast kingdom. His eyes sparkled, and with a wide smile he shouted joyfully that this was Arcadia. Countless games existed here, and an enormous number of secrets were hidden within them. All information was drawn into a digital sphere. Like Pac-Man devouring cookies, data flowed endlessly. The digital core rapidly filled with knowledge, from developer jokes to items that could greatly influence gameplay. The young man held the core in his hands. These were known as Easter eggs, or secrets. The shell of the digital egg slowly peeled away, and a puzzle lit up in the darkness. It suddenly merged with another brilliant light, and glowing particles fell into a girl's hands. The protagonist smiled sarcastically and said that he would entrust this to her. Now, Alice placed her hands against her chest, and without lifting her head, quietly replied, "Yes." A book appeared in the air, and she added that it was meant for a wanderer from future generations. The young man lay within the capsule, immersed in a virtual reality where the brain connected directly through simulated sensations. It created a complete world indistinguishable from the real one. Such a device might seem impossible, yet it already existed. The Dreamer inscription burned a vivid red. Jae Young now stood in the game lobby, surrounded by other players. Stepping outside, he saw even more people. Some were calling out for companions to hunt monsters and complete quests, while others were buying iron ore. Watching all this, he smiled in confusion and wondered what exactly this world was. There was no sunlight in the narrow alley between the houses. The protagonist waved his hand, and a system screen instantly appeared before him. It informed him that as a player named Dex, he possessed only 3 starting items. Resting his hand against his chin, Jae Young muttered that the inventory was not as complicated as he had expected. A new notification suddenly appeared, announcing a training task. To complete it, he needed to kill 1 slime. A small slime emerged nearby. Imagining how other players might struggle, he told himself that making precise movements in Arcadia was difficult, which was why skills existed to assist players. Icons representing abilities such as dash, bounce, and cut appeared before him. The slime noticed Jae Young and moved toward him. He tightened his grip on the sword and told himself that, as the owner of an extraordinary talent, this would be easy. With a single swift strike, he split the slime in 2 and completed the task. Smiling in satisfaction, he felt that he was already getting used to this world. Another notification immediately appeared, stating that a new task had been unlocked. Seeing this, he exclaimed that no matter what it was, he would figure it out in no time. To his surprise, the second task required him to read 100 books. Jay stared at the system screen in confusion. Inside the Elan City Library, books filled every shelf. 2 girls sat at the main table. One of them smiled and remarked that he was quite unusual, since he had been reading continuously for several days. Nearby, the protagonist was deeply absorbed in a book. The purple-haired girl suddenly closed her own book and told her friend that reading in the library was nothing special. Her companion abruptly turned around and said not to pretend ignorance, because nowadays, due to quests, most people simply grabbed a book, skimmed through 10 pages, and left. She then asked whether she had ever seen anyone read as seriously as he did. Jae Young frowned and muttered angrily to himself that he would clear this stupid game no matter what. Looking at him, the purple-haired girl replied that he would probably finish soon. After some time, the protagonist pointed at the book in his hands and asked whether they had the second volume. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked why he suddenly needed it, wondering if he had even read the first volume. Jay placed the book on the table and explained that the first volume mentioned several interesting topics, and he wanted to read more about them in the second. Lowering his gaze, he added that the book, The History of Arcadia, Volume 1, was the oldest imprint of Ilan. As he said this, he introduced Alice, who still did not raise her head. At that moment, a blue light flashed in the girl's eyes. After some time, another book appeared on the table. Handing it to Jae Young, she said that it was the second volume and that he could read as much as he liked, as long as he remembered to return it. Beautiful patterns were engraved on the book's cover. The protagonist suddenly lifted his head and said that he was simply curious. He then asked why the second volume was kept separately. The girl smiled faintly, raised her hand to her face, and replied that it was a special book that could only be obtained by asking the right question. As the boy reached out toward the book, the closer his hand came, the stronger the energy it emitted. System screens appeared around Alice. Without lifting her head, she reported that a special event had been detected in the Adalin newcomer village. The conditions for issuing a secret task had been met, and the player to be examined had been selected. Holding the book, The protagonist smiled as he read. Long ago, there had been a legendary adventurer who hid a treasure in the lake near the Elan newcomer village. Everyone claimed the treasure was mere fiction, as no one had ever found it. The only confirmed fact was that the treasure was the oldest imprint of darkness. Something shimmered brightly in the depths, surrounded by chained hands of darkness. In the past, this amulet had sunk rapidly to the bottom, and it was said that the legendary adventurer had hidden it near the shore of Lake Dellen. Yet no one had ever discovered the imprint of darkness there, and the legend was slowly forgotten. After finishing the passage, Jay continued staring at the book and told himself that if the lake was near Edelin, then it could only be Lake Eruin, located near the entrance. With that thought, he found a map on the book's pages. Lake Eruin was marked in a special color. After some time, birds flew beneath the evening sky as the protagonist arrived at Lake Eruin, located south of Edelin. Letting out a heavy breath, he told himself that he had only come here out of curiosity. Darkness, or anything of that sort, should not have been able to hide in such a peaceful place. Flamingos stood quietly on the opposite bank when all of a sudden, a system screen appeared above Jae Young's head. In the same second, several more screens burst into view in a flash of light. They reported that the final condition for creating a quest had been met. A quest had been generated according to the given parameters. The difficulty was rated B, the importance A, and the quest rank B+. The main scenario had been activated. The level of the first level player dex had been analyzed, and the quest was now active. Immediately after, a separate system screen appeared. It announced that the rank B+ quest, Find the Imprint of Darkness, required verifying the authenticity of the records claiming that the oldest imprint of darkness lay within Lake Eruin and locating the imprint itself. Jae Young's eyes widened in shock. He wondered whether he had truly received a B+ rank quest in a game that had only just launched, when even the hardest raids were no more than rank C at best. Before he could finish that thought, however, he smiled in satisfaction. Things were finally becoming interesting. A cloud of dark energy suddenly rose from the surface of the water. Even from the shore, a faint yet ominous glow could be seen. Deep within the lake, something stirred and a monster slowly opened its eyes. As evening approached, the sky took on a warm hue. The protagonist walked slowly through the nearby forest, scanning his surroundings. He muttered that there was nothing unusual around, which only made the situation feel even more suspicious. Suddenly, surprise flashed in his eyes. He stared at the water and said that it seemed to be there after all. Rolling up his sleeves, he smiled and declared that it was time to begin. With that, he accelerated forward. Holding his breath, Jae Young leapt into the lake. A loud splash echoed as water sprayed in all directions. He plunged downward, and as he descended, his eyebrows lifted in shock. This was far too deep for an ordinary lake. Below him stretched nothing but endless darkness. At the same time, in the Korean branch of Arcadia, a massive screen lit up with an exclamation mark. Words appeared announcing that the main scenario had been activated. The authorized executive general manager of the Korean branch frowned deeply and asked what had happened. Displeased that the main quest had begun on a server that had been open for less than a week, a subordinate approached and, spreading his hands, explained that according to reports from the quest department, a player had come into contact with an object tied to the main scenario. The director pressed further, asking what kind of action could shake the game itself. Receiving no satisfactory answer, he closed his eyes and said that the issue needed to be reported to the president immediately, and that all departments should prepare for unexpected situations. As the staff hurried out of the room, he continued staring at the enormous screen and muttered that the main scenario had opened only 4 days after launch, while the American server had remained quiet for 3 months. He wondered aloud whether this was simply because the server was Korean. On the large display, bold yellow letters announced that the main scenario, Birth of Deep Darkness, had been activated. Back at the lake, the protagonist finally emerged from the water. Sitting on the shore, system screens appeared before him, informing him that his diving skill had increased to rank B. His stamina had risen by 1 point, and he could now dive deeper and remain underwater longer. Water streamed down his face as he muttered that he must have descended nearly 200 meters without seeing the bottom. Hope slowly faded from his eyes, and he wondered whether he should simply give up. The rays of the setting sun reflected across the lake's surface. Thinking of the countless other players, Jae Young reminded himself that the game had only just begun, and that everyone was fighting for a place on the leaderboard. Clenching his fist, he added that he was wasting valuable time leveling his swimming skill during such a crucial period. More importantly, the monthly fee for the Dreamer was $920. With that thought, he recalled the capsule he had purchased for this game. Lowering his head, he admitted that he had planned to cover the cost by selling in-game items, but at his current level, finding something worth $1,000 within a month was unrealistic. Suddenly he remembered the system screen that had appeared earlier, informing him that he had unlocked a new quest, a secret quest. Coming back to himself, Jae Young looked at his hand and said that this secret quest had appeared for him alone and was unavailable to other players. Gazing at his reflection in the water, he muttered that it would be terrible if the reward turned out to be worthless. Yet, as a true gamer, he knew he could not give up. Smiling broadly, he declared that he would do everything in his power. As the sun slowly sank beyond the horizon, daylight still shone brightly in Silicon Valley, where Silicoff's headquarters stood. The president's office doors looked luxurious, and the name Jenica Paul was displayed on the wall nearby. Inside, a 15-year-old girl, the part-time president of Silikoff, lay on her bed surrounded by plush toys. Her eyes widened in shock as she received a message, and she screamed in disbelief, asking what it meant that the main scenario had been activated on the Korean server. A large system screen appeared before her, and a man named Jack smiled as he explained that a Korean player had discovered an item that unlocked a secret player class. According to Alice's analysis, there was a high probability that the item was connected to the main scenario. Hearing this, Jenica braided her hair irritably and asked whether they had truly placed something that important in a newbie village. Still smiling, Jack replied that it was not them, but that bastard. As he spoke, an image of a man standing with his back turned formed in his mind. Upon hearing this, Jenica bared her teeth and shouted, asking if it was that damn bastard again. She grabbed the tablet on her desk and began searching for information. In less than a minute, she found the secret class Anarchy Bard, which was still unclaimed. After reading through the details, she frowned and asked what kind of class it was. Since it had no level system and no special skills, she questioned whether it was even playable. Jack replied that in exchange, the class granted a special ability. Surprised, the president raised her head and asked what kind of ability it was. Lowering her gaze back to the tablet, she read on, and in the next instant, horror filled her eyes. Her scream declaring that all of this was sheer madness echoed through Silikoff's headquarters. 10 days later, sunlight shimmered across the lake as the protagonist burst out of the water, an amulet clutched tightly in his hand. Smiling broadly, he shouted that he had finally obtained it. Immediately, a notification appeared informing him that his diving skill had advanced to rank A, his stamina had increased by 1 point, and his affinity with water had risen by 10 points, allowing him to dive into even darker depths. A massive system screen then appeared, announcing that he had completed the quest, Find the Imprint of Darkness. As a reward, he received the Necklace of Darkness, which contained the imprints of antiquity. The system warned him to think carefully before using it. Holding the necklace up as sunlight struck its surface, the protagonist examined it closely. Raising one eyebrow, he wondered why its description sounded more like a warning than a reward. A few seconds later, a system screen appeared before him, asking whether he wished to use the Necklace of Darkness. After thinking for a moment, Jae-young clicked the yes button. Immediately another prompt appeared, asking if he was truly sure. Slightly surprised, he agreed again, only to be asked once more whether he really wanted to proceed. Growing even more confused, he confirmed again, but the system continued to question him repeatedly, warning that once the necklace was used, it could never be removed, even if he regretted it later. Finally enraged, Jae-young turned around and shouted that he had already answered clearly and did not understand why they kept asking him the same question. At once, the system screen changed, stating that it understood him now. Reading this, he frowned uneasily. From the other side, a developer's message appeared. The speaker smiled as he explained that Jae-young seemed confident enough in his desire, so there was no need to ask any further, though it would be too late to regret it later. His cold gaze was fixed on the system screen as he continued, saying that Jae-young should now give it his all and enjoy himself, just as he was doing at that very moment. A drop of cold sweat slid down Jae-young's face as he asked in confusion who was speaking. Before he could finish, a blinding flash erupted before his eyes. When his vision cleared, he saw a stone statue and a system notification announcing that his class had been changed to Anarchy Bard. In the pitch darkness, a series of notifications appeared. His level system had been disabled. However, he had acquired an influence trait. A mission system had been added. A character had been permanently bound to him, and a new quest had been assigned. Jae-young read through everything, shock filling his eyes. Then, unexpectedly, a quest titled Rookie Killing appeared. The objective was simple and cruel. He had to kill rookies who had not yet completed their class change, and he had exactly 1 week to do it. On the western grassy plains of Idolin, beginners were hunting slimes, collecting slime materials. One boy smiled broadly and shouted that he was coming, then smashed a slime with all his strength. After killing the monster, he obtained a slime bubble. A girl immediately ran over and exclaimed that it was worth 50 bronze. He replied cheerfully that he was very lucky, and added that this was how the game should be played. A second later, the boy stood up and shouted that they needed to keep killing slimes there for the rest of the weekend. His partner asked what about the trial exams next week. All this time, Jae-young had been watching them from a distance. His brows knitted tightly as he asked himself whether he really had to kill beginners like them. Hours earlier, a system screen had appeared before him, informing him that his character could not be deleted. Jae-young had stared at it with his hand outstretched. Realizing that nothing he did would change it, he had let out a heavy sigh. Looking again at the system screen, with his character displayed behind it, he muttered that it felt as though he had stepped on a mine. He had received a hidden class along with countless warnings, and his first instinct had been to delete the character. The reason was simple. Opening his inventory, he saw that beneath his nickname, it clearly stated that he had no level. Placing his hand against his chin, Jae-young muttered that this truly would not work. His character had no level system, yet the core of the game revolved around increasing stats. He imagined other players with their levels displayed above their heads, and realized that without such a system, he had no way to grow stronger in the conventional sense. For now, the difference was not obvious, but when other players began leveling up, the gap would only grow infinitely larger. In his mind, the ground seemed to split apart as the strongest players of the game appeared before him. Horror filled his eyes as he imagined facing them. Then he remembered the smiling developer who had told him to try his best and destroy everything in his path, just as he was doing now. Letting out a heavy breath, Jae-young lowered his head and muttered that he should have stopped the moment he heard that nonsense. He should have checked everything more carefully. Fluffy clouds drifted across the blue sky as Jae-young lay on the grass in a starfish position. He watched torn leaves carried by the wind and told himself that nothing would change if he simply lay there. Remembering the statue in the darkness, he reminded himself that his class was Anarchy Bard. Raising one hand, he added that even if the class was trash, it was still a hidden class, and it had to be useful in some way. He stared at the system window for a long time, searching for anything important. Eventually, he found something unusual in the stats tab. Alongside strength, endurance, and other attributes, there was a stat called influence. Its value was 0. Frowning, he asked himself what it was. The moment the thought formed, a system screen appeared, explaining that influence represented the ability to change the rules of this world by consuming corresponding stats. However, once used, those stats would disappear forever. After reading this, surprise filled Jae-young's eyes as he wondered what such a concept truly meant. The system screen closed, but another notification immediately appeared, informing him that he had received a new quest. What he saw caused cold sweat to bead on his face. The quest once again involved killing beginners who had not completed their class change. Now Jae-young was peering from behind a tree with a grim expression. He watched a loving couple of players, and wondered whether the system truly intended for him to kill all these newcomers, and whether this quest would decide his entire fate within the game. Lowering his head slightly, he asked himself what he should do. After a brief pause, he raised his head and said that he should at least try first. With that, he gripped his sword, pouring his magical energy into it. Jae-young told himself that there was no need to blame him for any of this, because he was also just playing the game. After that thought, he rushed forward. He closed the distance to the beginner couple at high speed, but suddenly a sharp cracking sound rang out, and the air filled with a filthy aura. A man with long green hair smiled and said, "What a pity," adding that he could have killed him with a single blow. The girl hurriedly helped her partner up, shouting angrily and demanding to know who they were. Standing before the newcomers were 3 bandits. Their leader wore a wide smile as he announced that they were the owners of this hunting ground and asked who had given the newcomers permission to hunt on their territory. Hearing this, Jae-young frowned in irritation. What was wrong with these weirdos? Hadn't the beta only just opened? Were they seriously trying to claim territory already? Tears welled up in the girl's eyes as she shouted in fury, asking what they meant by their territory. This was a beginner hunting ground, a public area where anyone could hunt. Why should they need permission from anyone? Suddenly one of the bandits leaned toward her and told her coldly that she was too noisy. From her accent, he said, it was obvious she lived in Seoul. Above his head floated a red nickname, and the number 12, marking his level. He continued, saying that he had overheard them talking about trial exams, which meant they were probably high school students. With their nicknames, he could likely track down their real identities. The color of his name made Jae-young's eyes widen. A red nickname meant that the player had already killed others. The air grew heavy with bloodlust. The girl trembled in fear as she listened. The leader smiled mockingly and asked if she understood what he meant. Squatting down, he ordered the beginners to leave if they did not want to die. The girl turned away and screamed desperately for help. Other players nearby began to avert their eyes, pretending not to see. At that moment, her partner stepped forward and asked why they were doing this. It was just a game. Couldn't everyone simply enjoy it? The bandits looked at him in surprise, then burst into loud laughter. They shouted that he was right. It was just a game, a virtual world, and that was exactly why they were doing this. The beginner clenched his teeth in fear. The bandit leader sneered and said that this game was wonderful because there were no laws. It was a world where strength decided what was right. Bloodlust filled his eyes as he repeated that it was just a game. Unexpectedly, the aura in the air shifted violently. Jae-young stepped forward and said firmly that he agreed with him. A sharp strike whistled through the air. One of the bandits screamed as his leg was severed. Jae-young smiled broadly and echoed the same words, saying, "What a pity." because he could have killed him with a single blow. In the same instant, he unleashed several rapid attacks. Blood sprayed from the bandits' mouths. At that moment, Jae Young's nickname turned red. A notification appeared, informing him that his influence had increased by several points at once. Anger and hatred still burned in his eyes. As he read the messages, he realized that he gained 1 point of influence for each kill. How exactly this stat worked was still unclear, but gaining it would not be easy. Suddenly, he turned around in surprise when loud voices thanked him. The beginner couple had dropped to their knees, shouting that he had saved them and that they wanted to repay him. Raising his eyebrows in surprise, Jae Young replied calmly that there was no need to thank him. He added that he would kill them too because that was the nature of his task. The two froze, mouths hanging open in shock. Lifting his sword behind his head, the Anarchy Bard said there was no need to be upset. Smiling widely, he asked, "Right? After all, it's just a game." The boy stared at him in terror, thinking that he could feel it. This man was truly insane. The next instant, the sword flashed, and the boy fell. Jae Young's influence increased by 2 more points. All around, other players had been watching everything unfold. Slowly turning toward them, Jae Young said that it was now time to move on to those who had simply stood by and watched. With a wide smile, he added that it was nothing personal, and hoped no one would object. Fear and despair spread through the crowd. Less than a minute later, heart-rending screams echoed through the forest beneath the blue sky. Players fled in all directions, trying desperately to escape the madman. That day, a rumor spread across Arcadia's homepage. A player with a crazed smile had slaughtered everyone in his path. Everyone said the same thing. A true madman had appeared. That night, a bright moon hung in the clear sky. An owl perched silently on a tree branch, its glowing eyes reflecting the silhouette of a player sprinting through the forest. He ran as fast as he could, tears streaming down his face as he screamed for help. Suddenly his foot caught on a root. Under the starlit sky, a dull thud echoed through the forest as he fell. A system notification appeared, informing him that he had suffered an injury and that his movement speed had decreased. Gritting his teeth, he tried to stand. Then he turned around in horror. 2 red eyes stared at him from the darkness. Slowly the figure stepped into the moonlight. When the fleeing player saw who it was, his pupils trembled with fear. Jae Young was smiling madly. Pressing his back against a tree, the player screamed that he was a bastard. He said he had just been minding his own business, hunting monsters, and demanded to know why Jae Young was trying to kill him. In silence, Jae Young drew his sword from behind his back. The player shut his eyes and suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs, asking whether Jae Young really thought the administration would leave him alone if he acted like this right after the game's launch. He shouted that he would file a complaint against him. The moment Jae Young heard those words, he stopped abruptly. Lowering his sword, the Anarchy Bard let out a heavy breath and asked what he meant by that. Raising his eyebrows, he explained calmly that he was only doing this because he had been told to. Hearing this, the player frowned in shock and asked what he had just said. Before he could finish, the sword flashed. His body was split in 2, and Jae Young's influence increased by 1. With glowing eyes, Jae Young turned toward the moonlight. He removed his hood, yawned lazily, and muttered that he was exhausted. In Arcadia Online, there existed a death sentence system. The hands of the clock moved slowly as time passed. A death sentence deprived a player of access for 24 hours. Although it was meant to combat addiction, it also served to enhance the sense of consequence and immersion within the game. Inside a vast, brightly lit office, countless people worked in the customer service department of Arcadia Online. The director frowned deeply and demanded to know what the hell was going on. His subordinate lowered his head and replied that complaints about violent incidents had suddenly begun pouring in. Anger flared in the director's eyes as he asked whether this was really happening at a time when they were already overwhelmed. What kind of lunatic was causing this? In the end, the customer service department was forced to work overtime. Meanwhile, Jae Young opened his stats window and stared at the number displayed before him. His influence had reached 1,025. Standing beside another fallen victim, he said quietly that it seemed he had killed 1,025 people, which was not bad for 2 sleepless nights. Letting out another long yawn, he added that it had been harder than he expected. Being hated for killing others created a strange and uncomfortable emotional state. A tear welled up in his eye as he wondered whether it was normal to feel this way, after slaughtering so many newbies right after launch. He questioned whether this would cause serious problems for the game itself, and more importantly, why he had been given such a quest in the first place. He looked at the system screen informing him that he still had 4 days and 20 hours remaining on his current quest. After a brief pause, he turned away and said indifferently that it had nothing to do with him. Suddenly he froze and turned around when he heard a familiar sound. Slimes emerged from the forest, looking dejected at first, but then their expressions brightened. Because the protagonist had saved them, their favor toward him had increased. What happened next shocked him. The slimes rushed forward and clung to him in a clumsy embrace. Holding one of them in his arms, the anarchy bard muttered that he had just been thinking about how unlucky he was socially, but at least he could still communicate with them. At that moment, he heard distant voices and looked up in surprise. Flickering torchlight could be seen among the trees. Instantly, he understood what was happening. After gently patting the slime, he said that he would like to play with them a little longer, but if he did not start running now, others would hunt him down, and that would complicate things. Enraged players soon burst out of the forest, their leader scowling furiously. Spotting Jae Young as he fled, the man pointed at him and shouted that they needed to chase him. Jae Young sprinted forward at full speed. In the distance, the edge of the forest came into view, drawing closer with every second. Less than a minute later, he found himself standing at the edge of a cliff as the pursuing players emerged behind him. Their leader laughed loudly and shouted that after running so long, he had ended up trapped at a cliff's edge. There would be no mercy now. He was finished. Jae Young looked down silently. Then a smile spread across his face. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and fell. His body plunged rapidly down the cliff. The players stared in shock, shouting that the madman had actually jumped. He was insane. As Jae Young fell backward toward the ground, a huge smile remained on his face. At the very last moment, he logged out. Soon after, a video detailing the horrifying actions of a novice killer appeared on the official Arcadia channel on YouTube. The comments exploded with heated discussion. One player, who had been killed by Jae Young 2 days earlier, wrote angrily that he was a newbie who had been slaughtered and had been browsing the forums ever since. According to the records, there were already more than 700 cases. He added that the killer only operated in areas where slime spawned, meaning he was unlikely to be high level. Someone immediately replied, asking whether it was really possible to commit 700 murders. With trembling fingers, the player answered that it was absolutely true. That was why he was planning to form a squad to hunt down and eliminate the killer. Anyone interested was asked to contact him, along with the time and location of the gathering. In Arcadia, on a street within the kingdom, a fountain stood at the center of a plaza. Players who had been killed by the protagonist gathered around it. Their leader furrowed his brows and declared angrily that they were beginning a meeting to cleanse the world of the troll. One of Arcadia's defining features was that its virtual reality allowed not only the creation of scenarios through in-game systems, but also through the actions and will of players across the world. Under the nickname In Cosmo, a red dot glowed within the system. Anything could be implemented and manifested as content, because everything ultimately occurred according to the will of the artificial intelligence that governed the world. Everything happened at the will of Alice. Without raising her gaze, the girl reported that a large group had been detected, and that the cause was now under investigation. A related quest was triggered. Main scenario, Act 1, Forgotten Darkness. With a casual wave of her hand, she generated a new system screen. At the same time, a notification appeared before the leader of the gathered players. At that same second, the quest appeared before every member of the group. It was a newly issued mission requiring them to capture a serial killer who targeted beginners in slug habitats. At the Korean branch of Arcadia, inside the scenario team responsible for planning and creating quests, a massive exclamation mark suddenly appeared on the central screen. Beneath it, bold text announced that the main quest had begun. Seeing this, a man's eyes filled with anger as he shouted, demanding to know why the quest had appeared so suddenly. His subordinate adjusted his glasses and replied that they were still trying to determine the cause. Toon, the head of the scenario team, turned around abruptly and shouted even louder, asking whether they truly intended to slack off during such a critical task. What kind of chaos was this? The game had only just launched. All his subordinates stood at a distance, staring at the enormous screen with their mouths agape. The warning did not disappear, because this was classified as an emergency. If it had been an ordinary quest distributed to all users, the department would not have been so tense. But in huge yellow letters, the message clearly stated that the main quest had begun. A few minutes later, one of the staff members approached the manager and reported that they were certain the quest was related to main scenario Act 1, but it had not followed the team's expectations. Only 2 days after the main quest had been generated, it had already been launched. Hearing this, shock filled the man's eyes. Generation and activation were two entirely different concepts. Just as a planted seed does not instantly sprout and bloom, a generated scenario normally required several months to influence all users and become a true world-level event. This was exactly what the development team had predicted. All members of the scenario team continued staring at the screen. Toon placed his hand on his chin and muttered that 2 days was too short to call the prediction wrong. But there had to be a reason. Scrolling through graphs and statistics on his tablet, he suddenly noticed a video and frowned. What kind of newbie killer was this? He raised his head and asked his subordinate what it meant. The man lowered his head and replied that the user in question had been roaming slug habitats, the hunting grounds of beginners, committing murders, and that he appeared to be directly linked to the activation of the main scenario. The team leader asked sharply whether they had any information on this killer, who he was, or where he lived. The reply came hesitantly. They had tried to investigate, but headquarters had imposed restrictions, and they lacked the authority to dig deeper. Hearing this, Toon frowned inwardly. Was it really headquarters themselves? Why would they go to such lengths for a single user, and who exactly was this person? At that moment, shock flashed in his eyes. On his tablet, he saw the confirmed number of players killed by the suspect, 1,025. Sunlight streamed through the window of a small house. Jae Young was lying asleep on his bed. He slowly opened his eyes. Few minutes later, a glowing screen appeared before him, announcing that a special event had been created to restore justice. The objective was to eliminate the evil criminal who had taken over the beginner hunting grounds. Jae Young stared at the screen, confused, then frowned as realization dawned. It was talking about him. Below the announcement were 2,637 comments. Annoyance flickered in his eyes as he muttered that this would be troublesome and that he did not want any unnecessary complications. But should he really stop? Glancing at the dreamer capsule in his room, he reminded himself that he still had many fees to pay. Walking up to the device, he hesitated briefly. A few minutes later, he found himself once again standing in the fields where slugs hopped about. Raising his eyebrows, he muttered that he had not expected them to create a quest specifically to hunt him. Slugs with all kinds of expressions bounced around the area. Lowering his head, he admitted that this truly was the perfect place to hunt beginners, but it looked like he would need to find somewhere else now. Suddenly he heard a familiar sound and looked aside in surprise. A slug hopped up to him, its expression unusually sorrowful. At the same time, Jae Young heard angry voices nearby complaining about how difficult slugs were to hunt. Two players emerged from the forest, one laughing at the other for choosing a mage class. The other replied irritably that he had not known killing slugs would be this hard. A player with the nickname Ep-1 suddenly grinned and said that he had found the slug they were looking for. The slug hurriedly hid behind Jae Young. The players rushed out of the forest, shouting that they had found it first. They demanded that he respect common courtesy and not steal someone else's loot, adding that he should not even touch the slime since it had very little health and could die easily. Hearing this, the anarchy bard looked down. The slug gazed back up at him with a pitiful expression. For several seconds, Jae Young did not move. Discontent slowly surfaced in his eyes. He took a few steps toward the players. One of them gritted his teeth and cursed, asking what was wrong with this bastard. Another suddenly frowned and said that the man looked familiar. Jae Young frowned in irritation. At that moment, Ep-1 grew angry and stepped forward aggressively. He shoved Jae Young and demanded to know if he had gone deaf. Jae Young's face was cold and indifferent. Then suddenly he smiled broadly and shouted that player killing had begun. Shock appeared in Ep-1's eyes. The anarchy bard abruptly collapsed to the ground, screaming that he was about to die and shouting that the criminal was here. Hearing this, players who had been searching for the serial killer turned around with blazing eyes and rushed over. Ep-1 shouted frantically that this was all a misunderstanding. He said the stranger had just been blocking the way, so he pushed him. Spinning around, he insisted that it was true and urged them to take a closer look at the suspicious man instead. But before he could finish, he saw Jae Young already sprinting in the opposite direction. In the next instant, the players charged after him, shouting for him to hand over the event reward. Driven by the mob, the newcomers were pushed relentlessly toward the edge of a cliff. Suddenly the magician's mouth fell open in shock, as he finally remembered where he had seen those sinister eyes before. An image from the video flashed through his mind, and he realized with horror that this man was the same killer from the rumors. He shouted loudly that they had all been set up. At that very moment, an unbelievably powerful explosion echoed through the forest. Clouds drifted slowly across the blue sky above the treetops. The main character was sitting calmly on a tree stump, looking at the slime beside him, as he muttered that he had barely managed to escape. Lifting the creature into his hands, he happily asked whether it had really been following him the entire time. The slime responded by affectionately rubbing against its savior, causing Jae Young to laugh as he asked whether its injuries were already healed. Several system screens appeared before him, reporting that he had saved the slime from danger. As a result, the favor of the slime species toward him had reached its maximum, and he had earned the title Friend of the Slime. Jae Young read through everything with wide eyes. Raising his eyebrows, he commented that if he killed newbies while saving slimes every time, then receiving such a title made perfect sense. Placing his hand on his chin, he added that gaining the favor of level 1 slimes alone would not change anything. What he needed was a true turning point to continue playing this game. Suddenly something sparkled in the sky. A system notification informed him that he had fulfilled the minimum requirement for the influence stat. Because he had developed a friendly relationship with the slime species, he was now able to help them using influence. After reading this, Jae Young asked in surprise what it meant to help. After a brief pause, he opened the system window displaying the slime stats, alongside vitality, mana, and other attributes. He saw something unexpected. The slime's influence was listed as 1,025 units. The moment he saw this number, shock filled his eyes. Then, a wide smile spread across his face. Sunlight streamed down through the treetops as Jae Young laughed loudly, shouting that this game was completely insane. It was unbelievably fun. Now he finally understood where influence could be used. After a short while he activated magic on the slime. A system prompt appeared, asking whether he was certain of his choice, warning that the influence would disappear forever. Jae Young smiled confidently, and chose yes. In the next instant, a blinding flash of light erupted. A pillar of magical energy shot up into the sky, and a notification appeared announcing that the slime's basic attributes had been altered. The creature's eyes turned a bright crimson, and its level rose to 15. Monsters were beings that players were meant to defeat. Their existence was essential to RPG games. Among them were beginner monsters, hunted by new players, and training monsters, designed for basic practice. In Arcadia Online, slimes filled that role, but what would happen if these beginner monsters became so powerful that new players could no longer hunt them? Now the slime's eyes burned with red flames. The consequences soon appeared on Arcadia's official YouTube channel. New videos were uploaded every day, drawing hundreds of thousands of views. Some people watched players climbing strange towers, while others enjoyed lighthearted clips guessing whether someone in a video was a beginner. Then a video titled "Two Strong Slimes" was released. It quickly reached a staggering 1.5 million views. The video opened on a forest scene. The player looked down at his hands and remarked that he could even see the lines on his palms, praising the incredible graphics. He glanced to one side, paused, then looked to the other. Suddenly he spotted a smiling slime nearby and laughed, commenting on how amusing its movements were. After a moment, he drew his sword and said he would try to kill it. In the next second, the slime locked eyes with him and charged. It leapt at the player as he screamed in terror, begging for help. A few seconds later, the video ended. The player had died and received a death sentence, preventing him from logging in for 24 hours. There were 3,687 comments beneath the video. Some laughed, asking whether the uploader was pretending to die from a single hit. Others replied seriously, saying that slimes had become abnormally strong and that they too had died the same way. This was the result of 1,025 influence invested into a level 15 slime whose eyes burned red, a terrifying outcome caused by what once appeared to be harmless monsters. Arcadia gained an average of 10,000 new players every day, but as the slimes rose in strength, entire beginner zones were wiped out, and players fled in panic. One day, a slime lay basking peacefully in the sun when a player attacked it. The player frowned and shouted in disbelief, asking what the hell was wrong with this slime. He had done no damage at all. His friend screamed and ran, asking why his health had nearly dropped to 0 after only 2 hits. From above, the main character watched them calmly and said to himself that total chaos had begun. Without taking his eyes off the players, he added that slimes were supposed to be passive creatures that only attacked when provoked. So why had they become aggressive, attacking first? As he pondered this, he watched a smiling slime leap toward the terrified player. Resting his hand on his chin, Jae Young wondered whether their stats had changed after leveling up. If so, then it was all because of influence. As the thought settled, he remembered the blinding flash of light from before. This was how influence could reshape the game itself. It was far more dangerous and hardcore than he had ever imagined. Suddenly, shock flashed across his face. The players who had been chasing him earlier were now surrounded by slimes. Their leader shut his eyes and screamed in horror, begging the monsters to leave them alone. He shouted in disbelief, asking how mere slimes dared to attack them. The next second, a slime slammed into him. Columns of dust burst into the air. The slime landed with a wide smile. After killing the newbie in a single blow, it hopped off in another direction. The remaining players stared in horror as their companion died instantly. Then the rest of the slimes pounced. As the enhanced monsters slaughtered the beginners, Jae Young's influence began to rise. Watching this unfold, he smiled broadly and licked his lips in satisfaction. This outcome, he decided, was far better than he had ever expected. 2 hours later, thick clouds continued to drift across the blue sky. At that moment, Jae Young's influence had risen to 3,924 units. Seeing the number, he placed his hands on his hips and laughed happily, saying that he had gained this much in just 2 hours. It was nearly 4 times more than the influence he had collected earlier, making the efforts of the previous 2 days seem insignificant. After a brief pause, he opened the rookie killing quest, noting that he still had 4 days remaining. He told himself that there was no need to rush to complete it, and then wondered whether he should enhance the slimes to the maximum to gain even more influence. However, when he checked again, he found that level 15 slimes could not be enhanced any further. Turning away, he muttered that he knew it would not be that easy. A few seconds later, he looked back and said that this was probably enough, so it did not really matter. The slimes bounced happily in front of him. Jae Young waved his hand at them and shouted that he was counting on them. At the same time, the Korean branch of Arcadia Online was bathed in sunlight. Inside the building, a man slammed his hands onto the table in fury. The director gritted his teeth and demanded that the report be brought to him immediately. Toon stepped forward with a pale face and reported that at 13:20 today, they had confirmed that the stats of slimes had increased abnormally. Because of this, the number of deaths among new users had risen sharply, and the situation was still ongoing. Sunlight streamed through the large windows as the director asked whether there had been any response from headquarters. His subordinate replied that they had submitted multiple requests, but had not yet received any answers. After calming down slightly, the director asked how much stronger the slimes had become. If they were only twice as strong, he reasoned, the situation should not have escalated to this extent. Toon lowered his head and replied that the slimes had become 10 times stronger. The director's eyes widened in shock, and he demanded to know what he had just said. Staring at him intently, he asked again whether it was really 10 times stronger, not 2 or 3 but 10. None of the subordinates dared to raise their heads. Suddenly the director clenched his teeth. Realizing something, he sprang to his feet and shouted, asking how much base health new users had. Cold sweat poured down Toon's face, as he answered that new users had exactly 100 health points. Hearing this, the director raised an eyebrow in disbelief and began to speak, but before he could finish, his subordinate folded his arms and confirmed the implication. For a level 1 beginner, a single hit was enough to die. Spreading his arms slightly, the director imagined a slime with brightly glowing eyes. After a moment, he strode away with firm, hurried steps, muttering angrily that everything happening in Arcadia could not be the result of a simple mistake. The world had been calculated down to the smallest detail using the most advanced technology. Something like this should have been impossible. Less than a minute later, he arrived before a virtual reality capsule. Opening it, he said to himself that if he could not understand what was happening from reports alone, then he would investigate personally. With that, he sat down inside the capsule. His consciousness quickly descended into the game, and as a level 3 administrator, he was granted access. Manhwa carefully stepped onto the ground inside the virtual world. Gritting his teeth, he said that he had come here to uncover the truth. Turning around, he faced Ellis. The girl was levitating calmly in front of him, her expression completely emotionless as she looked at him. Meanwhile, the protagonist returned to the beginner hunting grounds where the slimes lived. Raising his hand to his chin, he said in surprise that there was no one around. This worried him, since there were only 2 days left to complete his mission. Frowning slightly, he realized that he had begun killing players much more slowly. Fewer people were coming here now, likely because news of the danger had spread everywhere. On top of that, players above level 15 had started hunting in this area, making it difficult for him and the slimes to compete. In other words, there would be no easy path forward anymore. Lowering his gaze, he looked at the number of players he had killed, which stood at 9,987. He told himself that his situation was not so bad, since the counter had not stopped completely. As soon as the thought crossed his mind, the number changed to 10,000. Immediately a system notification appeared, announcing that he had killed 10,000 newbies. This was an achievement no one had ever reached before. He was now recognized as a merciless killer, known to all. As a result, he received the title Newbie Killer. Moreover, because he had exceeded the reward limit for the mission, he was granted an intermediate reward. An image of a treasure chest appeared before Jae Young, along with a claim button. Seeing it, he smiled broadly and said that he was very lucky and was now curious to see what was inside. With that, he pressed the claim button. At the same second, purple lightning tore through the space around him. Suddenly, a powerful energy explosion resounded through the air. Gritting his teeth, Jae Young shouted in alarm, asking what was happening. Was this really a trap disguised as a reward? Why were there so many exaggerated special effects? A few seconds later, the pressure from the shockwave faded, and he saw a dark sphere hovering before him. Raising his eyebrows in surprise, he muttered, asking what this black object was. Was this really his reward? At that moment, cracks spread across the surface of the core. An overwhelming surge of magical energy erupted in all directions, and a system notification informed him that the reward calculation was complete. He would now receive a massive monster with glowing eyes appeared before him. Smiling wildly, it asked who had dared to summon him. Horror filled Jae Young's eyes as he wondered what kind of being he had called forth, given the terrifying pressure it emitted. But almost immediately, that horror turned into shock. A powerful aura enveloped the monster, and a system screen appeared above its head, announcing its identity. It was the Lord of Chaos, the Demon King, Satan. A few seconds passed before the Demon King laughed loudly, saying that a full summoning was too much for this world. It seemed he had been forced into a younger body. Satan now inhabited the form of a young man, and scoffed that it did not matter. Even this amount of power should be enough to grind those angelic bastards into dust. But before he could finish boasting, he suddenly realized that his strength was far weaker than expected. Furrowing his brows, the Demon King roared furiously, demanding to know what kind of place this was and what was wrong with his body. Why did he look like this? Why was he so small and stocky? He turned toward Jae Young and asked whether he really dared to summon him. Jae Young scratched the back of his head and replied that he did not know how he had done it. He had simply claimed an intermediate reward, and the next thing he knew, Satan appeared and was labeled as his familiar. The moment Satan heard this, shock and fury collided in his eyes. He lowered his head and shouted in rage, asking why in the world he had become a familiar. Did he really have to obey someone now? He continued ranting, saying that this was not a mutual contract but a forced one. What was he supposed to do now, after everything he had accomplished in the demon world? Jae Young watched him from the side, eyes filled with disbelief. He had imagined the Demon King of Chaos in his true terrifying form, yet the being before him was only a smaller version, loudly cursing that his demonic life had been ruined. Suddenly, Satan floated upward, and looked at his master again, declaring that he was leaving. But since he was bound by contract and forced to remain as a familiar, they would have to stay together for a while. With that, he casually sat down on Jae Young's head, folded his arms, and said that since it had already come to this, he was counting on him. Jae Young frowned stiffly, wondering whether he should feel happy about the Demon King sitting on his head. At that moment, Satan suddenly straightened up in midair. Touching his chin, he exclaimed with excitement that he had far more power than he initially thought. At the same time, system notifications appeared before Jae Young, explaining that the influence he possessed could be used to activate a familiar's abilities. However, since his familiar was a demon, he was warned to be wary of deception and temptation. Satan laughed madly and said that he finally understood why he had been dragged into this contract. If used properly, he believed his master could even destroy those halo-wearing chickens. Jae Young asked what he meant by that. The Demon King shoved his hands into his pockets and asked whether Jae Young would allow him to borrow his power. Confused, Jae Young asked what power he was referring to. Satan pointed at him and asked whether he was seriously pretending not to know, since this power was capable of turning the laws of the world upside down. Hearing this, Jae Young's eyes widened as he asked whether the demon meant influence. As he spoke, he remembered the blinding flash that had occurred when he strengthened the slime. Satan nodded toward himself and confirmed that this was exactly what he meant. Humans, he said, clearly had limitations when using influence, so Jae Young should entrust it to him. If he agreed, Satan promised to reward him generously. At the mention of a reward, Jae Young imagined mountains of gold. Opening his stats window, he saw that his influence had reached 8,975 points. He realized that this was a power even the Demon King desired, which meant it was extremely important within the game. Frowning slightly, he asked what Satan could offer in exchange. Satan's smile widened. Stretching out his hand, he formed a glowing magic seal and asked what Jae Young thought about exchanging all of his power right now for this. The light from the seal intensified, revealing an artifact. It was Nergal Sai, the cloak of the Lord of the Second Army of the Underworld. However, the required level to use it was 150. Jae Young's eyes widened in disbelief. He muttered that this was insane. He had heard that on the American server, which had opened earlier, the highest level players were only around level 50. For him, this requirement was impossibly high. After a moment of thought, he raised his eyebrows and said that he did not need it. Satan snapped his fingers in annoyance, and asked whether that was still not enough. He added that it was obvious Jae Young would not be satisfied and asked what he actually wanted. Jae Young kept his gaze fixed on the familiar, and replied that he did not need anything in particular right now. Suddenly, an idea struck him. Remembering something important, he asked whether it was possible to strengthen monsters. The Demon King tilted his head, and asked which monster he meant. Jae Young answered without hesitation, saying, "Slime." Confusion flickered across Satan's face. Then he clutched his stomach and burst into loud laughter, shouting that his master was completely insane. No one had ever made such a request of him before. When Jae Young asked whether it was possible, Satan pointed at himself and declared confidently that everything was possible for him. He then asked how much Jae Young was willing to offer. At that moment, Jae Young had exactly 8,975 influence points at his disposal. Smiling widely, the protagonist replied that he was willing to give everything he had. The moment the Demon King heard this, a satisfied smile spread across his face. Declaring that the deal was sealed, a massive magic seal appeared beneath them, and at the same time purple lightning tore down from the sky. Satan acted without hesitation. A level 100 Slime Queen was created. Elsewhere, a player thrust a spear of fire forward and killed a slime. Holding the weapon in his hand, he laughed loudly and said it was too easy. Tossing the sword over his shoulder, he added that he had no idea what kind of bug this was, but it would be a sin not to take advantage of it. No one could have imagined that slimes would give so much experience. His companion nodded and said that a slime was still just a slime. Even if it reached level 20, it had a primitive behavior model, so it remained a simple enemy. The player scrolled through the interface and said that this was great. While he did not know how beginners were faring, For players like them, slime habitats had become perfect hunting grounds. The rapid leveling was already paying off. If everything continued at this pace, he suggested aiming for a spot on the rankings. The group walked forward casually, saying that it was unlikely they would reach the rankings, but if things kept going like this, they could at least try. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet split open. Dark magical energy seeped from the cracks, and an unknown voice echoed through the land, commanding the weak creatures who had been killed without reason to release their rage. The players stared in shock at the overwhelming surge of magical power. The voice continued, saying that this race had once lived here peacefully, but now they must remember the villains who slaughtered them because their revenge was about to be fulfilled. On the horizon, a small army of slimes appeared. Their bodies had turned purple. The players froze in disbelief, recognizing the monsters they had just been farming moments earlier. The ground shook violently again, and one of them screamed, asking what was happening. Was this an earthquake? Then his mouth fell open in horror. Slimes began falling from the sky. Covering his face with his hands, the player screamed for help and shut his eyes in terror. After a few seconds, he forced himself to look again. Purple slimes leapt past him, rushing forward with purpose. Confusion filled his mind as he wondered where they were going. His companion, staring into the distance, asked in disbelief whether his eyes were deceiving him. Was it really all slimes? The slimes began to merge. Countless bodies fused together into a single enormous mass. At the same time, system screens appeared before all the players. They stared at the notifications, asking one another what was going on. The system messages shifted in color from blue to purple, and announced that the slime race, which had once leapt joyfully across the fields and loved peace more than any other creature, had been subjected to cruel and merciless slaughter by humans who appeared from nowhere. They had endured it for a long time, but finally reached the conclusion that they could no longer tolerate it. In order to restore peace, they chose to fight. For that purpose, they sacrificed themselves, offering their lives to create a deity who would lead their race. Before the eyes of every player, the level 100 Slime Queen appeared. Her eyes burned with rage and hatred. Raising her head toward the sky, she let out a deafening scream. A massive shockwave erupted outward, tearing trees from the ground by their roots. A player wearing an eye patch leapt onto fallen logs, hearing the screams of others begging for help as they cried that they did not want to die. Suddenly he froze. His mind went blank as he watched the enormous Slime Queen rise into the sky. From a distance, the main character observed everything. Cold sweat streamed down his face as he asked the familiar what he had just done. Satan replied casually that he had simply strengthened the slimes exactly as requested. Jae Young stared at him in shock and said that he had asked for that, but not to this extent. At that moment, another shockwave struck them. They resisted with all their strength as Satan laughed joyfully, shouting that her power was incredible. With just a little more, he would not even mind adding her to the demonic legion. Clenching his fist, he added that although these were lower life forms awakened by revenge, he never expected them to sacrifice themselves to create a deity. The protagonist asked what kind of revenge he was talking about. Satan winked and replied that humans killed slimes the moment they appeared, so he merely amplified their desire for revenge, and all of this was achieved with the influence Jae Young had given him. Hearing this, Jae Young raised his eyebrows in shock and asked what he meant. Satan looked at the enraged Slime Queen and explained that even a tiny grain of power could strengthen a race to this extent. Imagining the glowing artifact in his mind, he added that this was exactly the kind of power he possessed. Clenching his fist, flames ignited in his palm as he declared that this power was influence. At that moment, the enraged slimes charged toward the players who had hastily formed defensive lines. A brutal battle against the monsters erupted. As a result, the Catch the Rookie Killer quest was removed from the main scenario, and a new quest, Rage of the Slime, was added. Every player received a notification, even those standing in safe zones. A massive system screen appeared, announcing that the ancient darkness had been forgotten. A dark entity had awakened suppressed rage. From this moment on, the slimes would destroy humans at any cost. The player's task was to repel the attacks and protect their homes. If they failed, the newbie village would be destroyed forever. They had 7 days. Horror and panic spread through the players as they screamed and demanded to know what was happening. Was the village truly going to be erased forever? What would happen to them afterward? What was wrong with this game? The earth and air began to tremble violently. A girl turned her head in shock. At that moment, all players saw the Slime Queen rising high into the sky and understood one thing clearly: they were finished. Black clouds drifted across the sky as Satan asked the owner what he planned to do next. The man sat calmly on the edge of the cliff and countered with a question of his own, asking what Satan was suggesting. Satan replied that everyone was desperately trying to restrain the slimes. After a brief pause, he rubbed his hands together and proposed that the man slip in and shatter the guardian stone himself. The protagonist immediately realized that this bastard was simply provoking him to act according to his own desires. Instead of taking the bait, he answered that he would rather watch for now. Hearing this, Satan flew back and screamed in frustration, demanding to know why he was choosing to stand by as a spectator. Then all of a sudden, a wide grin spread across his face. He shouted that he finally understood. The man was waiting for the very last moment to crush all hope of victory. Satan declared it amazing, simply wonderful, and laughed with shining eyes, praising him as a true villain. He added that he was eagerly looking forward to what would happen next. Jang silently told himself that he would ignore the familiar entirely. Soon after, a flood of notifications surrounded him, reporting that a newcomer had been killed by his forces. His expression turned cold, as he acknowledged inwardly that everything was unfolding exactly as he had been told. He needed to make a decision: players or monsters. On the battlefield, the purple slimes leapt at the players in a frenzy. The protagonist slowly extended his hand, wondering which side was truly worth standing on. At that moment, an overwhelmingly powerful magical aura erupted from the Slime Queen. She opened her massive mouth, and her status window appeared, displaying her skills and traits. Her abilities included Leader's Dash and Jump, while her specialties were Collective Mind, Rapid Regeneration, and Hatred of People. All of this information was broadcast on a massive screen for everyone to see. Inside the control room, the director and his subordinates stared at the broadcast in silence. Manhwa folded his arms and frowned deeply. Suddenly, one of his men jumped to his feet and shouted that the server needed to be restarted immediately. There had to be some kind of error. Tahan clenched his fist and insisted that there was no other explanation. A level 100 monster could not possibly appear in a beginner area where new players were still learning their classes. G, the head of the design department, frowned and agreed, adding that they had never even created a concept for such a monster. At the very least, the Korean branch had not. From the looks of it, this had been done by higher management, and she believed they needed to take action. Tahan leaned toward the director and began shouting that they should file a formal complaint. He demanded to know who the developers thought they were, abusing their authority by allowing something like this to happen. In contrast, Monghan lowered his head in silence. He remembered the notification announcing the start of the main quest, the sudden launch of the main scenario, the suspicious quest involving mass killings, and the footage centered on the main character all came back to him at once. Meanwhile, the director stared at the image of the Slime Queen and calmly stated that the slime raid had finally begun. He raised his hand to his chin and quietly wondered if this was truly the beginning. After a short pause, he lowered his hand and asked his subordinates whether they really believed this chaos was part of what the company intended to achieve. Topard asked why he was bringing this up at all. The director frowned and replied that there were endless possibilities and endless freedom within Arcadia. Did they honestly think management was capable of orchestrating something this elaborate? Were those lazy fools who dumped all planning and event organization onto them truly capable of such a grand design? Xia turned to him and asked what he was implying. Monghan then raised one finger and explained that everything they were witnessing had been done by a single player. The start of the main scenario, the slaughter of the newcomers, the manipulation of the slime's characteristics, and even the appearance of the boss monster had all been caused by one person alone. The room was instantly filled with shock. The large screen illuminated the stunned faces of the staff as voices erupted, questioning how such a thing was even possible. Yet the explanation made sense when viewed through the lens of quest history. Tun raised his hand to his chin and asked thoughtfully whether this meant all of these events were the result of one abnormal player's actions. The director continued frowning as he answered that if everything truly stemmed from a player's choices, then they had no right to interfere. That was Arcadia's policy, even if it led to punishment.